Sure.
Okay. Good evening to our audience and participants in this book launch and discussion. But of course, it's a good morning to Professor Lampton, who's joining us from the United States. Today, we will look at a new book that came out earlier this year. And of course, it's called Rivers of Iron, Railroads and Chinese Power in Southeast Asia, which is this book. The book was launched earlier. I think it was the 1st of April in Singapore, of course, through a webinar. And then in May, there was also another launch in Indonesia, which was organized by the CSIS. And so it's our privilege for the ISC to be able to launch this book in Thailand today. And we have with us the three authors who work together on this book. The subject of railroads and Chinese power in Southeast Asia seems to be something that has caught the imagination. And also, of course, it fits in with the another fascinating subject on a great power competition in Southeast Asia, as well as the subject of China's relations with Southeast Asia. I scanned through quickly and noticed that in 2020 and 2021, there already have been about 6 or 7 books on the subject of China and Southeast Asia that became available. So it is a subject that I think a lot of people are suddenly returning to in this fashion. And the book that we will discuss today, of course, examines China's efforts to create this kind of inter-country railway system connecting China and Southeast Asian neighbors. The book look at the political strengths and weaknesses of the plan, the capacity of the recipient countries to either shape or take advantage or even resist China's actions. And also it seeks to explain how domestic politics in the Asian countries, the Southeast Asian countries, shape their varying external responses and behaviors. As I said, we have today the 3 authors of this book, starting with Professor Lampton. Professor David Lampton is Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, and also a research scholar at Stanford University's Asia Pacific Research Center. Selina Ho is Assistant Professor and Chair in the Master in International Affairs program at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. And the third author, Cheng-Chwee, is Associate Professor and Head of the Center for Asian Studies, the Institute of Malaysian International Studies at the National University of Malaysia. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins. So these are the authors. And as I said, the book will deal with the questions of railroads and Chinese power in Southeast Asia. And I'm sure most of our audience probably more interested in the question of the Chinese power in Southeast Asia rather than purely on the question of the railways. So without further ado, let me pass the floor to Professor Lampton to start off the discussion. Please.
Well, Thank you, Dr. Anuson, and I want to welcome all those in our audience and wish you all good evening if you're in Asia, and good morning if you're in the Americas, as I am. This launch of the book Rivers of Iron, Railroads and Chinese Power in Southeast Asia, as Dr. Anuson said, is importantly about the issue of Chinese power and how Americans and people around the world ought to think about Chinese power. But it's also very importantly about the power, influence, and agency of Southeast Asian countries in their interaction. I think in the United States, there's been a kind of tendency to look at China as this sort of unconstrained great power bestriding continents, changing everything in its wake. And of course, China is influential, it is powerful, and it does have impact. But a point that's very central to our book is that the peoples and countries around China's periphery, particularly in Southeast Asia, do themselves have agency, influence, and can shape the degree to which China achieves its objectives or does not, or has to modify its vision as it interacts with others. So the underlying model here is really one of reciprocal influence. Of course, China's bigger economically, militarily, in almost every regard. So we have to take that into account. But I think Dr. Anuson mentioned other books that have been written about China and its dealings with Southeast Asia recently. This book, I think, is somewhat distinctive in as much as it starts out from a kind of reciprocal influence model rather than unidirectional Chinese exerting power on its neighbors unconstrained. I do also want to take this opportunity to thank publicly Dr. Anuson for not only hosting and moderating this program, but in the course of our project, he was continually a major intellectual contributor to our thinking and guiding us as we did our field and documentary research throughout what eventually was 9 countries: China, the 7 Southeast Asian countries between Kunming, China, and Singapore. Plus, we had to look at Indonesia because it has a very large-scale high-speed rail project underway, but is not part of the topic of this book directly. I also want to just acknowledge that because this was a project that covered 9 countries, it obviously took a long time, about 5.5 years. It involved field research and interviews in large numbers of countries, localities, multilateral organizations, multinational corporations, and so forth. And therefore, it required financial support, and we certainly want to thank the Smith Richardson Foundation, Stanford, and my home school of SAIS for the financial support they provided for this long-term project. I also just want to thank Thailand and Dr. Anuson and all of the people we talked to in Thailand. Thailand is very central to the project that we're talking about, and we had nothing but cooperation from all of the people we met in Thailand. I think in particular, particularly memorable was our field research trip in 2017 from Bangkok all the way up to Nong Khai and then into Laos and indeed all the way to the China border. In that effort, we were really greatly assisted by Professor Jantima in Thailand, and we thank her in the book, and we want to thank her again publicly. That very important field trip could not have happened without her assistance. Also very interesting and memorable in our research in Thailand was the trip from Bangkok to Nong Khai and along the route of both the existent rail system and the path of the future rail system, assuming that it's built, were rail stations, and we talked to all of the station masters along the way and people in the path of the railroad. And so we want to thank all of the localities, and also the Thai State Rail Authority was very cooperative. So we had lots of cooperation, and we all want to express our thanks for that. Now, to the subject of the book, there's a lot of talk in the United States and indeed in China about what has been variously referred to as decoupling. That is sort of breaking or loosening the economic bonds of interdependence between China and the United States, and to be less dependent on international supply chains and have more, as the Chinese would say, self-reliance, or as the United States would say, sort of independent supply chains in strategic areas. Of course, I think some of this decoupling has already occurred. Probably more will occur. Really to the proposition that decoupling will be an important subtrend, but indeed interdependence, connectivity is still, and I think globalization, domestic high-speed rail system, how it got the technology, how it built. So I'm getting some kind of a message here. Can you hear? Good, okay. So in any case, it's about how China built this industry, acquired the financing of its domestic system, and then built an export industry that would be capable of exporting high-speed rail to its periphery, and indeed a global export industry, something like Boeing aircraft has been for the United States. I think that's sort of China's vision of a world-class industry driving both international economic competition plus its own internal development. This vision that China has, however, of the interstate high-speed rail system in Asia is not a Chinese idea. So one of the big points in our book is that in some sense, while BRI is talked about importantly and accurately as a Chinese initiative, this effort to build an interstate high-speed rail system really comes out of the vision of in the late 19th century European colonialists, the British and the French, and then later on in World War II, the Japanese. But then in the post-World War II system, ASEAN, later ASEAN, and Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia importantly, developed their own vision of rail connectivity in Southeast Asia. And importantly, what has happened in recent times, really since 2000, is a convergence between Chinese capability, that is, they had an industry, they built out their own domestic rail system, and then they saw the vision that Southeast Asians had of connectivity in Southeast Asia. And so they essentially have seized on a Southeast Asian idea and provided Chinese technology, financing, and so on to help partner with Southeast Asian countries. So I think an important theme is that not all good ideas, or for that matter, bad ideas, come from China, but China is responsive to its neighbors as well as taking the initiative. So this is what I would call a Southeast Asian train upon which the Chinese have jumped. Now, if you can put up the map, I think you can see the vision that I'm talking about. Can we have the map, Selina? Now, what we're talking about in this book is really derives from one day I was looking, I believe it was at the Straits Times, and some version of this map was in the paper. And it shows you essentially 3 north-south lines, high-speed rail lines radiating from Kunming down to Singapore by 3 paths, one to the west through Burma, down to Mandalay, and then to Bangkok, and then on down the Malay Peninsula to Singapore. You see Kunming due south going another line, the central line going to Vientiane, then Bangkok, and then Singapore. And then you see off to the east, Hanoi, a line going from Kunming to Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City, Phnom Penh, Bangkok, and to Singapore. So this map I saw in, I believe it was the Straits Times, triggered a question in our minds, really, of one, can this set of interconnective lines be built? And then what would be the effects of doing so? And what will be the difficulties, both political and technical, of building such a system? So we started this study with a very simple observation and question. The observation is China, in partnership with the 7 Southeast Asian countries shown here, broadly speaking, wants to increase connectivity by rail. And the question is, can China do it? How can China and its partners do it? What problems will they face? And what are the prospects for success in what kind of time frame? Now, just to give you a sense of the scale of this, each of those 3 lines that I identified and that you can see on this map is longer than the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. The Transcontinental Railroad here in the United States was built between 1863 and 1869, and it transformed America from a divided country. Indeed, we were in a civil war when it started, but it united our country, east and west coast. It set the stage for American power projection into the Pacific and into East Asia. And it transformed the American economy and knitted it together. So one of the basic questions, and it certainly relates to what Dr. Anuson asked about Chinese power, the American experience with such infrastructure is it changed our economy, our politics, and our global power. And so the question is, what would be the effect of this system, which is, roughly speaking, 3 times as long, knitting together China, which has 20% of the world's people, plus 7 Southeast Asian countries? So can China do it? What are the problems and what will be the impacts? That's essentially the set of issues that we are concerned about in the book. Now, in order to answer those simple questions, you had to have a pretty elaborate research project. And our data really came from several sources. One was on the ground. You really don't understand a problem until you're on the ground and see it with your own eyes. And so certainly a big part was on the ground field research, and we visited in one form or another each of the affected 8 countries in this. We conducted interviews in over 158 organizations, and I described them earlier. Also, we did extensive documentary research, local newspapers, documents from multilateral organizations, government documents, and so forth. I just want to note in passing, however, we had great cooperation in China when we started this project, and indeed, I should say, throughout the project. But I would note that our first set of interviews was done probably 5.5 years ago in China. And so we got a very good start in China with the interviews. If we had waited to interview in China until more recently, of course, the problems between the United States and China and general trends in China itself have made it less accessible. So I think we were quite fortunate that we began our interviewing in China when it was in a relatively open and forthcoming stage. And I do want to thank our Chinese interlocutors who were, generally speaking, quite forthcoming and revealing. Now, this book, I've emphasized what it's about in terms of the high-speed rail and its transformative potential and what are all the problems. But I want to say also the book is about a lot of other, what you might call bigger issues yet. One of the questions we address in the book is, what is the role of infrastructure in development? And one of our important findings in the book is that China's leaders, and we think Southeast Asian leaders, believe that infrastructure drives development. So early in the development process, you have to build infrastructure to drive urbanization, drive resource flows, concentrate activity along the connectivity lines. So in that sense, it seems to us that the Southeast Asian countries that we interviewed in generally are sympathetic with the idea that infrastructure is needed. And China, because of its own domestic system, its export industry, and its financing, is in a position to essentially share a broad objective with Southeast Asian countries, even though there are many divergent points when you get down to negotiation. So the book is importantly about the role of infrastructure in development. And I think the United States is coming to the awareness that it needs to speak to Southeast Asian desires for infrastructure and connectivity, and therefore in US policy is responding to the fact that China thus far has been able to provide much more resource and attention to this issue than many in Southeast Asia would like. In other words, the United States is beginning to emphasize infrastructure building in its own development policy. Secondly, in this book, we learn a lot about both how domestic politics in Southeast Asian countries and in China affect their foreign policy. And each of these countries has its own distinctive political constraints and institutions and economic level and culture and history of dealing with China. So each country is its own story. But an important part of the story is how the Chinese political system works, why Southeast Asia sees the face of China that it sees as it interacts with China on this rail project. Certainly, in another broad area, and Dr. Anuson suggested this when talking about Chinese power, what is the vision that China has? Why is it doing this? What are its purposes? And then what will be the geoeconomic and geostrategic implications of such large-scale Chinese participation in infrastructure building such as this project? Let me just wind up by trying to specify a few interesting findings. First and foremost, and I mentioned it, but I want to emphasize, countries like Thailand, and I would say Malaysia and Singapore, indeed all of them, but particularly those, have agency in dealing with China. These countries, often there's a mistaken image in the US that smaller countries on China's periphery are putty in Beijing's hands. They don't have much agency, that China is overwhelming. Well, I think our case studies in the book adequately demonstrate that Southeast Asian countries, now some more than others, I would say Laos and Cambodia may have less agency, and Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore may have more, but all of these countries have at hand resources to shape the degree to which China achieves its objectives. Secondly, relating to that question of what are Chinese purposes, I think we have to, and I'm sure, and I think Southeast Asian countries generally do, recognize the sort of enormity of the Chinese vision. And the Chinese vision is essentially to orient economic, social, and human flows to China, making China the economic hub of Asia. What you see before you in terms of the Southeast Asian economic corridor from the Chinese viewpoint is only one of 5 other economic corridors that are part of BRI. So this is part of a vision that China's implementing to make itself the economic and resource hub of East Asia. Of course, this has implications for Japan, not least. It has implications for the US. It has implications for all of its neighbors, including Southeast Asian neighbors. So I think we need to candidly recognize the scope and power of the Chinese vision. Just a final finding, I think, relates to the Chinese political system. I think Southeast Asian countries really see 2 faces of Chinese power. One is certainly economic power, but one is military and strategic power. And the question often arises, is this an economic vision China has, or is underneath it all a military vision? And I suppose the honest answer is it's both. And maybe it doesn't really matter whether it was the economic motivation or the military motivation that came first. The fact is that they feed on each other. As China gets assets and people located in countries all around its periphery, as more Chinese workers and multinational corporations, state enterprises, diplomats, tourists, Chinese tourists are in these areas, China gets more assets to protect. And therefore, the security apparatus and the Chinese military will follow along in the wake of that economic and resource activity beyond its borders. So even if the military wasn't an initial prime motivation of this program, it does have strategic military implications, and including all these railroads obviously run to major ports. And China's building up huge naval activity, civil maritime activity, and so forth. And so in these nodes where railroads meet ports, you find China developing industrial parks with neighboring countries and so forth. So this is a comprehensive economic and strategic undertaking with implications for every country in Southeast Asia and far beyond. So with that, let me ask Selina to talk a little about negotiation and implementing this vision. And then my good friend and colleague, Cheng-Chwee Kuik, is going to talk about the geoeconomic, geostrategic implications and why various Southeast Asian countries respond differently to this Chinese initiative. Selina?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And I would like to thank Anuson and ICS for organizing this event. It is our pleasure to be here. And also, the important thing is that I think I want to stress the point that Mike was saying just now, that Thailand is really the centerpiece of this, of our book, and the centerpiece of this vision, this Pan-Asia Railway vision. And as you can see from the map, all the routes, whether it's the east, central, or west routes, they all have to go through Thailand in order to reach Singapore. So Thailand plays a key role in this particular story that we're telling. This is just a picture of some of the fieldwork that we did. This is particularly in Laos. We're showing the Laos picture because the Laos part of the railway will actually be completed by the end of this year. The COVID pandemic has had not really delayed the progress of the railway in Laos. Now, so as Mike was saying, this book is really about Chinese power, and the title says so. So what we're really interested is in exploring the extent of Chinese power and influence. And what we concluded is that Chinese influence and power is really enormous. But while it's enormous, Chinese power is enormous, it's significant, it is not unlimited. I think that's the key message of the book that we want to put across. One of the reasons why Chinese power is not unlimited, it is not unfettered, there are limits to Chinese power, is because the agency of the smaller states. And correspondingly, China needs to act as restraint, what is known as great power restraint. Great powers actually need to act with restraint in order to get friends, to generate goodwill, and to get followers. So the part of my, I'm picking up where Mike left off in talking about the agency of the smaller states. And what really interested in is, what kind of roles that smaller states play. They can initiate projects, they can bargain, they can negotiate, they can resist, they can reject, and they have done all these entire span of behavior as we study the countries that are involved in this project. Now, let me focus just on the bargaining power of the smaller states as they negotiate with China. What are the conditions that determine how much bargaining power they have? Obviously, not all smaller states have equal bargaining power. There are certain conditions that will determine how much bargaining power they have. So let me start with size, wealth, and location. That really matters. So middle powers like Indonesia and Thailand would have greater leverage than Laos and are able to bargain for better terms for themselves. For example, Indonesia was able to get the Chinese to agree to no sovereign guarantees for the project, as well as a lower interest rate. Malaysia and Singapore as well are better developed countries, the middle income countries. So this gives them also much more bargaining power. Now, geography definitely gives Thailand a huge advantage. As I mentioned just now, Thailand is really the major piece of the Pan-Asia Railway. As all routes must pass through Thailand. Now, in fact, in one of our interviews, a key government advisor, a key Thai government advisor, actually described Thailand as a beautiful woman who can wait to choose the best suitor. Now, obviously, the suitors refer to the great powers that come wooing at Thailand's doorsteps. Now, for Laos, geography is definitely not, as I said, it can be bypassed to its east and its west. So in fact, in our interviews, there was this significant anxiety in Laos among Lao officials that Laos will be bypassed. Now, the second condition that determines the bargaining power of smaller states is what is the state capacity of these host countries? Well, secondary states have a lot more options when they have greater capacity. Capacity in what? Capacity in having more robust government institutions, rule of law, civil society, human resources, and the ability to regulate and to monitor. Now, Singapore has state capacity and is not overly dependent on China economically. However, countries like Laos are heavily reliant on the Chinese economy and for Chinese technical expertise. For instance, the feasibility study for the China-Laos high-speed rail was actually conducted by China. Now, the third factor that determines how much bargaining power smaller states has is the domestic politics and public opinion of these smaller states. Now, Cheng-Chwee will touch on domestic politics later on in his presentation, but let me outline some key points here as they pertain to bargaining. So if we think of bargaining as a two-level game, where the first level is international bargaining, and the second level bargaining is among all the domestic agencies. And in this area, public opinion actually plays a very great role. So leaders like former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib, and Indonesian President Jokowi have been attacked for selling their countries to China. There are concerns over whether locals will benefit in terms of technological transfer, job creations, and also Chinese companies often bring in their own equipment and materials from China, which in the process sideline local SMEs. There is thus this very big question of whether economies of host countries actually benefit. Now, negative public opinion and unhappiness over Chinese presence, and that's something that we notice quite a bit in Thailand, the unhappiness over Chinese presence in the area. This exerts significant pressures on the leaders. So if you were to come back to this two-level bargaining game, the win sets for the Southeast Asian politicians are really small. So in a sense, this ironically strengthens their bargaining position. So when they negotiate with China at the international level, at level 1, they can actually go to China and say, look, I'm actually putting my domestic position at risk here. But so you have to give me more concessions. It strengthens the bargaining power of the host country's governments. So let me now also turn to the implementation, some of the challenges that are involved in that. So as Chinese companies venture into Southeast Asia, they encounter problems and issues which they're not familiar with. Because when they operate in their own countries, it's a totally different system altogether. There's a lot of trial and error and learning involved as they venture into South Asia. Not that there are no problems with implementation within China at all, but that the problems actually multiply when these companies go abroad. They encounter very different political systems with a very confusing array of actors and veto points. For instance, decentralization in Indonesia has a great impact on acquiring land. The land acquisition part is actually the first step, the first phase of the entire process to build the high-speed railway. Now, as a result of the delays in land acquisition, the project was actually, the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway project was actually delayed for several years. So as we know, this democratization came to Indonesia in 1998, decentralization followed as well. The center becomes a lot weaker, while the regencies, the local governments became a lot stronger. So the Jakarta-Bandung Railway itself was actually an agreement between Beijing and Jakarta, two national governments, without consulting the local regencies, the local governments. So when Chinese companies try to acquire land from the local regencies, they actually encounter a lot of resistance. In total, 29 districts and 95 villages in West Java were directly impacted by the high-speed railway construction. So you can imagine the amount of difficulties Chinese construction companies face as they deal with powerful local authorities and very strong land tenure laws in Indonesia. Now, the second challenge of implementation for these Chinese companies is bureaucratic resistance. And you see this very much in the case of Thailand. For example, the State Railway Authority of Thailand actually makes money by selling their land, but actually loses money on rail operations. Now, this is very real. For a lot of companies, the first few years, first few decades even, is money losing. So this is something that's very real across all rail companies. So when you actually make money from selling land and you lose money on rail operations, compensation for the loss of land is a key issue when Thailand negotiate with the Chinese. There are significant legal obstacles to the construction of the Bangkok-Nong Khai high-speed railway as well. There are laws. Thailand has very strong laws when it comes to labor protection, procurement standards, land usage, and environmental protection. So these kind of hinder and slow down the process. These laws are great, but they do slow down the process. So in order to overcome this laws and to smoothen the process for the construction of the railway, Executive Order Article 44 was issued to overcome these legal barriers. Now, for any infrastructure, and especially for railways, which cross many jurisdictions, having a political champion is very important. And you can see this in the case of Malaysia. Former Prime Minister Najib was a very strong champion of the East Coast Rail Link, as well as the Kuala Lumpur-Singapore high-speed rail. Now, these two pieces are quite important pieces for the Pan-Asia Railway. However, when Najib actually lost power in the May 2008 general elections very unexpectedly, the projects actually lost a very powerful patron and was almost scuttled subsequently by the next government led by former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. Now, but essentially, after a few months of negotiations with the Chinese, the East Coast Railing was reinstated with more favorable terms for Malaysia. The KL-Singapore high-speed railway, as we know, has been cancelled as of now. Obviously, the next challenge is technical. And when I say technical, it's not just about the technology of high-speed railway. That's one challenge. But it's also about the terrain and the geography that these Chinese companies have to deal with. This is most obvious in a country like Laos. Laos is very mountainous. So it is essentially a huge engineering project that requires the Chinese companies to tunnel through the mountains. In fact, a total of 170 bridges and 72 tunnels are expected to be constructed. However, there are large amounts of unexploded mines remaining from the Indo-China wars. So this is another key obstacle, the number of unexploded mines. In fact, one Chinese railway project on the, one Chinese railway engineer working on the project actually said, we should have the United States demine the area. So this is one of the legacies of the Indo-China War. Now, in sum, I want to say is that there are these significant challenges that China experiences as it ventures into Southeast Asia, whether in terms of when they are negotiating the terms of the contract or when constructing the high-speed railway themselves. So in a sense, these challenges are proof that there are limits to Chinese influence and power. And the Chinese power and influence, while enormous, is really not unchallenged and not unfettered. And this is something that, a great proportion of our book actually focuses on that. The agency of the small states, this actually is one of the main contributions to our understanding of Chinese power. Chapters 4, 5, and 6, 3 chapters of the entire book actually focuses on the smaller states and what they can do to resist China. Now, that is what I have to say for my portion. Let me go on to Cheng-Chwee. Cheng-Chwee will elaborate more on the diverse responses of Southeast Asian states to China and the geopolitical and geoeconomic competition with other major powers. Cheng-Chwee?
Thanks very much, Selina. And let me thank Dr. Anuson and also SC for having us here. Sawadee Krap to everybody, the audience who are in front of your own screen. So on the basis of what Professor Lampton and Selina have presented, let me talk about the issue of responses before I move on to talk about geoeconomics and geopolitical dynamics of the entire phenomenon. So in chapter 4 of the book, we have these 2x2 metrics that not only explain, but also describe the type of responses across Southeast Asia, how smaller countries in the region respond to China-backed rail project specifically, but also Belt and Road projects in general. So you could see that the 4 quadrants here represents 4 types of responses. Some are more receptive than the others, and they are being explained by 2 factors along the 2 axes, the 2 variables. Before I talk about the factors, let's talk about the 4 responses. And you would see that quadrant 1 and quadrant 2 represent those countries who are more receptive, who are more positive and enthusiastic about the China-backed projects. So quartile 1, Laos, quadrant 2, Malaysia. These 2 countries are generally more receptive, more enthusiastic than quadrant 3, Thailand, and also quadrant 4, Vietnam. So you would ask, like, what are the measurements? How do we measure which countries are more receptive than the others? So basically, we are using 3S, scope, scale, and also speed, meaning that it's about the scale of the projects, the speed of negotiation, and also implementation, and also the scope, whether or not other than real projects. Is there any other infrastructure projects that these countries are involved in? So here you could see that Laos and Malaysia are more receptive in the sense that definitely many more projects are involved, real projects for sure. And in comparison, Thailand and Vietnam are more cautious and more less receptive. Vietnam, for example, there is only one urban rail projects in Hanoi. And then Thailand, we know that it's primarily about the Bangkok, Nong Khai. But at the moment, only phase 1 from Bangkok to Korat is being implemented stages by stages. And then phase 2 from Korat to Nong Khai is still very much under negotiation. So with all these indicators, you could see that Laos and Malaysia definitely are much more receptive than Thailand and Vietnam. So what explained that? So there are many domestic, many factors at work. Selina has already mentioned about a number of domestic factors. So here, to cut a long theoretical stories short, we will only highlight two specific domestic factors that explain why some countries are more receptive than the others. The most important factor that explain is about legitimation. So all governments, all ruling elites want to justify their power, their authority. So performance legitimation is the most important one. Performance legitimation in the sense that ruling elites try to justify, legitimize their power through economic performance. So development performance is very, very important. Professor Lampton early on has mentioned about we want economic growth, you need the infrastructure. So some of these smaller countries in the region, like Laos and Malaysia, and for that matter, Cambodia and others, including Brunei, all see China's Belt and Road as opportunities for development and hence the more receptive responses. So Thailand and Vietnam, of course, you could say that performance legitimation is also very important. But there are other pathways of legitimation, other domestic politics that counteract and also limit the extent to which performance legitimation can push the Thai elites and also Vietnamese elite to collaborate with China. Vietnam anti-China sentiment is very, very strong. So whoever in power in Hanoi, they will be very cautious to the extent they could collaborate and want to collaborate with China, particularly about the infrastructure development. So in Thailand, it's not so much about anti-China sentiment, but it's about Thai identity. The identity-based legitimation is really, really important. So during our fieldwork discussion with Thai officials and elites, we keep hearing expressions like, this is Thailand. We do things in Thai way. And they're pushing back China proposal, and they take, Thai clearly take time to negotiate, unlike countries in Laos and also Malaysia. So identity legitimation matters in explaining why Thailand is less receptive compared to Malaysia and Laos. So the final domestic factor that we need to explain here, it's on the other axis, you see pluralization. And this is a factor that the Professor Lampton has mentioned that applied that in his earlier work on China. And for this book, we apply pluralization to the cases of Southeast Asia countries. And we do notice that pluralization, meaning that to what extent and in what way political power is distributed across elites, competing elites, and also societal at large is very important. So countries which are more centralized, for example, Laos and Vietnam, decisions are much easier and quicker to make. And once decisions are made, they would stick. But in countries like Malaysia and Thailand, the power are more pluralized, are more decentralized, more contested. You see that lots of decisions, including those by the ruling elites or former elites, are being contested. And hence, in the case of Malaysia, you see that although Malaysia's response is very receptive, but it's also fluctuating. There is lots of cyclical recalibration. Whatever decision made by Najib was being questioned and suspended and renegotiated when Mahathir 2.0 came in. And in fact, after February last year, you could also see that the current government under Muhyiddin-led Perikatan Nasional Plus government is also making some amendments to ECRL, the East Coast Railing Project. So I would not go into the details. With the remaining time that I have, let me move on to the last slide that I have, which is about the geoeconomics and geopolitical dynamics underpin smaller countries' responses, but also big power competition surrounding the infrastructure and development projects. So here you could see that there is a list of initiatives from other powers, competing powers, who are determined to provide alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So here you could see Japan's Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. You have a US Build Act 2018. You have a EU-Asia Connectivity Strategy, and you have a Blue Dot network involving primarily the Quad member countries. And in fact, as we talk, we will remember just a few weeks ago, during the G7 summit, there are also new initiatives that are labeled as the BBB3, right? 3B1W, Build Back Better World, that the G7 has promised the developing countries that they are going to launch some alternative program. And then a few days ago, EU also came out with a new initiative that is called as Globally Connected Europe. We are anticipating a key document will be launched by EU as a group in September. So we are seeing all these dynamics that some analysts describe them as geoeconomics, but my co-authors and I, three of us argue in our book that in 21st century, in large part because of China's Belt and Road, and also along with other competing powers, competing initiative, geoeconomics are geopolitics. Although those projects are economic development in nature, but you know that they are very much driven by geopolitics. So that's among the conclusion that our book tried to put forward. And Mike also argued very convincingly that towards the end of the book, the concluding chapter, the book talked about balanced connectivity. So smaller countries' perspective, we do want connectivity, we want infrastructure connectivity, transport connectivity. And on our own, Singapore Coming Railing has already demonstrated that on our own, we do not have the kind of resources and also capital and technology to materialize those infrastructure projects. So we have to rely on external powers. But fundamentally, for smaller countries, we do not want to putting all eggs in any powers basket. So from smaller countries' perspective, the more, the merrier. We do welcome and want to see more alternative being put to us. But fundamentally, and that's my final point, fundamentally, with all these in a long list of initiatives from smaller countries, Southeast Asia countries' perspective, I believe Kuntai included, we would believe what we are seeing. So we can have a lot of initiative, but all these initiatives will have to be translated into concrete capital and technology and put on the table for smaller countries to consider and also to negotiate. Only with that, we would not be able to see the balanced connectivity that the book argued and also concluded. With that, let me end my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much all the three authors for their presentation. I think there are several interesting concepts that have been presented in the book and also presented by the authors. I think one of the major trend in narratives coming from the West when they look at this question tend to be that we don't have the so-called agency. The countries in the region don't really have agency. Secondly, I think it's also interesting that the book should point out, because it's also contrary to popular narrative, that all these developing projects or development projects originate from China. So the book is rightly points out that several projects predated the BRI, and also they were locally or they were initiated within the region. A very good example is if you look at the ASEAN Master Plan on Connectivity that came out in 2010. I think it was well before BRI even started. So I think these are some of the interesting points that the book made about these development projects in the region. And another thing was I can assure you, I think if you come to Bangkok next year or whenever it is possible, you will see that the project, this particular one, the high-speed rail link to Nong Khai, it's beginning to take shape, but of course it takes a long time. And one of the major testament to that is that the major development within Bangkok, the Bang Sue Grand Station will start fully operating next month. The first train system that will use that station will be the suburban red line, which will start a trial service from the 2nd of August. And of course, that station is the terminus station for the high-speed rail link to China, to Nong Khai, to Laos and China. So I think it's coming. The pieces of the jigsaw are being put down, but a little bit, maybe a little bit too slowly. I think one of the questions I think our audience may be interested in hearing a little bit more, and I could put to the three authors, is of course a question on the small state agency when it deals with a big country like China. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit more. I don't know who wishes to start.
Well, maybe I'll take a stab at
yes,
it,
okay,
because I was hoping that would be a question you would ask. So I think this question of agency and what are the specific forms it takes. I think, first of all, each of these states has the capacity to have its own vision. So each of these states needs to go into negotiation with China, if they do, with their own idea of what they want. And so I don't propose to speak for Thailand, but my understanding, Thailand has a vision of its own as to why such a project or projects might make sense. And my understanding is that Bangkok is sort of in the position in Thailand or in Southeast Asia that Chicago was in the American experience. That is a central hub for maritime land transportation, north, south, east, west. And if you look at a map, Bangkok is in exactly a similar analogous position. And so that Thailand doesn't see itself, as I would understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, does not see itself just connected north-south, China as the economic hub. We are sort of distant spokes. It seems to me that Thailand has a vision of its own centrality in the region. And so Thailand thinks about India and Myanmar and Cambodia and Vietnam on an east-west axis, as it also thinks about itself on a north-south axis with China. So I would say the first thing that creates agency for a country is that it has its own idea and isn't just, as maybe in a sense, Laos would be the other example where Selina said, look, Laos had to have China do the feasibility study, right? Well, if your prime contractor is the one telling you what you should want, that's a different situation. So I think the first thing is that these countries have the power of their own vision. And that's probably the most important thing, to go into negotiations knowing what you want. Secondly, just take Thailand again as a wonderful example. I mean, there is an international high-speed rail industry. Japan's important in it. South Korea is important. Canada's important. The Germans, the Italians, the French. There are other suppliers in the world. Now, China has a cost advantage. China's got all sorts of advantages. But for many years, and I understand there are temporary difficulties, but Thailand's been talking to Japan about a rail link from Bangkok to Chiang Mai. Well, we'll see what happens over the long stretch of history. But the thing that the Chinese fear the most is somebody chooses Japan, right? So you have alternative suppliers. And I think the West is beginning to think about building consortia to deal with the Thailands or the Malaysias or the Singapores. So you've got options. Now, they may not all be equal or equally cheap or whatever, but you do have options. Thirdly, a perfect example is Thailand again. when China didn't offer Thailand the interest rate on financing the project they were proposing, Thailand said, we'll finance it ourselves. Now, once again, Thailand has that option and Laos may not have that option, but you can get alternative financing or finance it yourself. And then finally, the answer that China fears the most is non-participation. If Thailand says no, then there's no Pan-Asian rail system, at least with Chinese driving the train, so to speak. So I think those are some of the ways in which there is agency here. I hope that's responsive to your question.
Thank you. Selina or Cheng-Chwee, you want to add something to that? Please go ahead.
Maybe I'll just add on to what Mike have said. I think that one of the, his first point about own vision and ideas of what we want, right? What countries in the region want, our own vision, our own ideas. I think one of the important things to remember is that a lot of what China does is that they don't bring really essentially new ideas to you. They actually don't force countries to adopt some of these things. I mean, Cheng-Chwee alluded to it too, because countries in this region actually initiate some of these things and take them because, it is in line with their vision. So it has whatever, one of the things about Chinese power and an agency is that whatever China proposes has to be in line with what the region wants, what the region already prefers, what does the government want, the development vision, right? So when there's this convergence of ideas and vision, then you can see that these things can happen. Otherwise, I don't think that any even China or any other great power can come to the region and say that, you have to do this, you have to do that, without this or that being part of our own vision. I think that's one important point to make. And then I think we have the ability to adapt, to modify whatever that China puts on the table. We take on things that are in our interest and discard those that are not. And our ability to bargain, which I mentioned quite a lot just now, our ability to bargain depends on certain conditions that we have in our own country. Some have more bargaining power than others. I think Cheng-Chwee probably have a lot more to say about this because he studies a lot of this, right?
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, just to pick up from what Selina and also might have already mentioned, I would only add the case of Malaysia as a case to show that host country, small country do have agency, but this agency, the ability to negotiate and also to push back and also to demand what we want actually fluctuate. Malaysia's case is interesting in the sense that they do see some up and down. You do see some up and down and also some enduring continuity, but there are also some disruption. For example, let me just take some example to illustrate this point. And in fact, I would begin from Mahathir 1.0 during his first tenure in 1995-1996. He was the one who proposed the Singapore-Kunming rail link. And when he proposed that, he actually involved China in addition to ASEAN countries. So that is already one indicator example of what Mike has mentioned. So agency meaning that you have the power of your own vision and you make things happen. So Mahathir did that. And he actually not only stopped at proposing, he actually institutionalized that mechanism involving 7 ASEAN countries and also China, 1996, 1997. And when financial crisis took place, it was stopped. But 2002, just before he stepped down, he resumed that agency, that mechanism again. And his successors, Abdullah Badawi, also proposed to China, not another way around. Many outsiders think that it's always China push, big power push. They overlook that more often than not, at least in the case of Southeast Asia, smaller countries try to pull China. So Abdullah Badawi, whom we call a Patla, proposed to China, Wen Jiabao, to support the second Penang Bridge in his home state. And once Najib took over, and that's of course before 1MDB, he also proposed something similar to have the Kuantan Industrial Park. And he actually proposed that again with Wen Jiabao, when Wen Jiabao and him launched the Qingzhou Industrial Park in China. And then Najib talked to Wen Jiabao that since we already have one industrial park in China, let's have a sister industrial park in Malaysia, and in the case of Kuantan. So that shows the kind of agency that Mike and Selina talk about. But of course, ECRL, the earlier stage at least present a negative example of a smaller state agency, in large part because of Najib's own 1MDB scandal and China bailout. And when you had to rely on China, and then that's the time that you do see some very low level of small state agency. But I think fortunately was that when kind of a government change took place in May 2018, through an election, when Mahathir 2.0 came to power, I think he reasserted some form of a small state agency by first announcing to suspend the ECRL projects together with 2 other projects, and also renegotiate. And renegotiation clearly is a good, best example to show small state do have agency. And this, in this case, it's a successful renegotiation that bring about some mutually acceptable arrangement, at least insofar as the information that is available to everybody is concerned. Yeah. So I will stop here. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just say one last sentence here, which I think is implicated. The implication is there in earlier remarks. I remember the interviewee, a Chinese person involved in planning these projects, and in exasperation, he said, you know, dealing with democracies is really difficult. That is to say, you get an agreement with one government, then you find there's a change, or you find a locality, or as in the case of Malaysia, you have different states with, in effect, sovereign power over their land. But the point is, democracies are more complicated to deal with than, let's say, more authoritarian systems, because there are more points that you have to win over, or there are more veto points. So I think an important part, and this isn't a generalized advertisement for democracy, but pluralized states inherently have more agency in a sense, because they have more ways to throw sand in the gears. In fact, the one European representative in Laos says, you know, even Laos, with its limited financial and technological resources, has 1,000 ways to throw sand in the gears of projects it doesn't like.
Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you. And to our audience, we also welcome your comments or remarks, questions. Please type and send them in. In the meantime, I think the points that we have been discussing, as I said from the beginning, is a bit contrary to popular narrative, especially Western narrative, when it comes to Chinese power. I think Selina said something about Chinese power being not unlimited. But I think when this is viewed from Western countries, they tend to think that we are like we just the backyard of China, and of course the Chinese power in this area is unlimited. So I think this book has made that point quite clear, and I think it would help to make that kind of narrative a little bit more, how shall I say it, more broad, and you know, you can look at it from different angle, and there are examples to be looked at and presented to the people who probably believe to the contrary. But if we're talking about Chinese power in general, and not just dealing with the question of the railways, how do you see it developing in the short term? Because I think the Western narrative here may be a bit correct in a sense, because when we deal with China on several issues like the South China Sea or something like that, it seems like Chinese power is unlimited. How would you go about dealing with China?
Well, let me take a stab at it. Those are all good questions. I think there are many ways to think about it. But you mentioned just at the end of your question, the South China Sea. And I think a point we make in the book is, of course, the Chinese are just as capable of pursuing counterproductive and mutually self-contradictory policies. So the Chinese are fully capable of working against themselves. So we observe, for example, in the book that, yes, to become more connected for the Southeast Asian countries to China, they have to have a certain confidence in China's orientation towards them over the long run. That is to say, there needs to be more confidence between the partner countries. But of course, Chinese foreign policy in the South China Sea, now Thailand may be more or less concerned than Vietnam on South China Sea, but in any case, China's activities in the South China Sea are not, generally speaking, very reassuring. So in these political systems, they're looking at China as an actor, and China in some actions is more reassuring than others. So first problem you have is that China's foreign policy now, if you believe in general, it's become a little more assertive, which I don't want to carry it too far, but I think that you can say that. That works against the confidence to become more interconnected economically and culturally to China. So I would say some elements of Chinese policy work against creating the kind of reassuring environment that would facilitate these projects. That's the first thing. The other thing is, at the beginning of your question, you sort of asked, why does the US see China as so powerful, and why is it promoting that vision rather than the one we're talking about a more constrained China? And I think that then gets to what our book makes the general point, that every country's got domestic politics that influence its foreign policy. And the United States now is very divided on many dimensions: development policy, how to deal with the world, how to order and govern our own society. And frankly speaking, the image of a strong, powerful, aggressive, assertive China better serves the domestic political purpose of welding a coalition that will facilitate a more coherent American policy. Practically the only thing Americans agree about now is China is a problem. And so I would say it's maybe hard for others to understand, but this has become a unifying issue. If you want to adopt building infrastructure and spend $650 billion for infrastructure in the US, one of the arguments you make is China is building its infrastructure both domestically and globally, and we will not be competitive unless we start getting in the infrastructure game. That is a very central political rationale here. You may not think it's very persuasive, or maybe you think it is. But in the American setting, China has become a device to drive a domestic coalition to become more competitive, both economically and militarily.
Well, that's a very interesting point. I think there are several other things that we could discuss from that. But going back to the question I posed, either Selina or Cheng-Chwee want to add something?
Yeah, if I could add something, Cheng-Chwee, but it's okay if I go first.
Yeah, go ahead, of course.
Okay, so actually all three of us, in many ways work on Chinese power. Mike has a book on, Chinese might, money, and minds, right? The three phases of Chinese power. And, you know, I have been working on the Chinese influence and power as well. And one of the things that we need to understand about power is that power is very complex. It's very complex. It is multifaceted. So as Mike's book, you know, Money, Might, and Minds suggests that different forms of power, right? So I think one of the things we have to look at is how is different slices of Chinese power and which ones are growing, which one is able to translate into influence, and which ones really don't quite work very well. So China can use coercion, it can use force, as you can see in the South China Sea, right? That's one. It can set agenda, there's agenda setting power. There's also the ability to set norms. That's part of the ideational kind of power. The ideas that you transmit, where BRI is an idea in itself, right? To get riches, you have to first build roads, that's an idea. So, and then that's one thing. And then the use of incentives, using reciprocity, you know, quid pro quos, right? Buying influence in that sense, right? Economic statecraft through the use of economic power. All these are actually different aspects of Chinese power. And what I would say actually from my own observation is that I think that China's ability to use incentives, reciprocity, issue linkages, quid pro quos are actually working out very well. If you can see from what BRI is happening and the number of countries that sign on. China's ability to set agenda is growing. If you look at the Mekong region, Anuson, Thailand is, Anuson, Thailand is very concerned about what's happening in the Mekong. With the Lampton Mekong cooperation, you can see that China has made great progress in setting, you know, the building institutions in the Mekong region and setting the agenda through the kind of meetings and the forums that the LMC actually organizes. So that kind of power is growing. You can see China agenda setting power is growing. Incentives and reciprocity, use of incentives and reciprocity, that is working very well because of using economic inducement through projects, through AIB, through BRI. And then you can see how countries are also buying its ideas and how very interestingly among ourselves, we all acknowledge that China has a place in this region. China is the dominant power in the region, although not necessarily the exclusive power. That is also in a sense a form of power because we recognize Chinese power in that sense. It's a structural kind of power. But I would actually say that, that China has actually not been very good in using coercive power. I think whenever China uses coercion, there's a lot of pushback and there's a lot of people who will react. And you know, you can see ASEAN trying to get its act together, even though it's struggling to do so, but trying to get its act together because China is looking like a big bully. When China uses coercion in South China Sea, you know, countries will react, and even if they don't say anything, they will actually behind the scenes react. You know, so coercion is something that coercive power, I think China is not working very well for China. Although, you know, the other aspects of power, I think is either China is really very successful in using economic inducements, incentives, institutional setting, agenda setting, that is growing. You know, and we all recognize that China is the dominant power and we accept that, you know, so that those are working well, but not coercion in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Guess I can only add one point, which is like from how we see from Malaysia and also I think Southeast Asia and elsewhere, smaller countries see one word from Chinese growing power, which is contradiction. Contradiction in the sense that on the one hand, as Mike and also Selina mentioned, China's powers are growing. And with that, China has bigger capability to actually offer what we want in terms of infrastructure, capital, technology, so on and so forth, the development that we want, that Western countries are not giving us enough. But on the other hand, China is also getting more assertive and also, I would say, even aggressive. I think Mike was the one who said that China is capable of working against its own interests. So Malaysia actually just experienced that on May 31st, which is like a few weeks ago. On the day of the two countries, Malaysia and China, are celebrating the 47th anniversary of Malaysia-China diplomatic establishment, when we were the first ASEAN country to have established that diplomatic relationship with China. So on May 31st this year, 16 Chinese aircraft flying near Malaysian airspace. And we were puzzled. We were puzzled in the sense that, I mean, China's show of presence in South China Sea near our water is not new. It has been a step up from 2013 onwards, just like many other places. But this is the first time that you are seeing them using 16 aircraft going to 30, 40 nautical miles from Malaysian coast on the day we are supposed to celebrate establishment of diplomatic relationship. So you see one word, contradiction. So how to explain that? Now let me put on an academic cap. And I think the earlier framework that we mentioned, legitimation, clearly explain not only Southeast Asia, but China as well. You look at China today, I think CCP, which has just celebrated the 100th anniversary, they are counting on primarily two types of legitimation, right? One is performance legitimation, performance in economic, but also in a handling pandemic situation. But on the other hand, nationalist legitimation is getting more and more important. So a lot of messages that you see from Beijing, from the kind of US-China interaction, bearing in mind, for example, it's not just Xi Jinping's statement on the 1st of July, but on the Yang Jiechi's statement when they had the meeting in Alaska. That was very clear. It's a matter of exercising or mobilizing identity legitimation about China's is getting more powerful, and don't forget the humiliation part of history. Yeah. So I think that two legitimation, performance legitimation and nationalist legitimation, explain why they are getting more and more contradictory. So on the one hand, I think China is getting more powerful internally, externally, but internally perhaps it's more shaky in terms of political terms. I'm pretty sure Mike and Selina will have more points on these two these issues.
Yes, well, anyway, thank you. If we have time, we may come back to this question of how nationalism is being played out along with the rise of China internationally. But I have some questions from the audience, so I'd like to put them to you. First question asks whether China has any plan or strategy to prevent small countries being fallen into a sort of debt trap.
Maybe I'll take a stab at that. And I want to say I agree with, I thought the points my colleagues made are really excellent in the last part. I just wanted to add one additional thought, which I think is important about how powerful is China. Does it work against its own interests? Part of the book and much of our interviews in Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar point to the fact that Chinese power isn't just a function of what China does, but let's just take the United States. We, the United States, are capable of working against our own interests. So, for example, when China comes in and offers to partner on infrastructure, at the same time, the US puts sanctions on Thailand for events in 2014, for example, or puts sanctions on Cambodia for obvious human rights problems. Or sanctions in Myanmar because of the role of the military and human rights issues there. The United States has not provided an option for these countries. If they say, we're not entirely happy with dependence on China, where else do we turn? The US, for its own good reasons, is imposing sanctions on countries, some countries, and not providing alternatives. So we had long discussions in Thailand, Myanmar, even Vietnam, certainly Cambodia, where the willingness of these countries to cooperate with the US is greater, but the US, because of our politics, puts limitations on our own willingness. So I just want to make clear that China is not the only country that can operate cross purposes, one policy from the other. Now, you asked about whether China has a plan or a strategy for these countries. And I think the Chinese have a vision of their situation and growth. And their understanding of their own situation is that growth in China is declining. It's still quite considerable. It's still quite good compared to the rest of the world. But over time, China's domestic growth rate is slowing as people become richer, as the efficiencies are pulled out of the system. It becomes harder to grow. Therefore, China needs to invest money in the countries around its periphery so that they become richer and provide bigger marketplace and more economic opportunity for China, and a place for China to put its excess capital and put its excess steel and its excess concrete. And so as China's growth rate slows, it's trying to accelerate growth on its region. It's basically the Chinese, and I think they're correct in this, their view is that it is easier to profit economically in a rich area than a poor area. So in this important regard, there isn't an intrinsic conflict between Chinese desire to see its periphery grow economically. At the same time, it fits in with their need to move its labor-intensive industry south, to build up its own supply chains, become less dependent on the West. So I would say the Chinese have a view of their own domestic economic security and growth that actually hopes to see an increasingly rich Southeast Asia. Now, of course, at the same time, China doesn't want to see Southeast Asia pulled into the Western orbit of opposition to China. So that they want a rich, but nonetheless friendly and maybe even compliant Southeast Asia. But I would say the Chinese have a vision of both infrastructure leading development and a desire to see Southeast Asia, which is already growing quite well, generally speaking, over the medium term. The Chinese vision is not entirely antithetical to what I would understand most Southeast Asian countries would like.
Anybody else? I think the question is also concerning whether the Chinese, how it deals with recipient countries falling into some this so-called debt trap.
Well, first of all, I think, as I was just saying, the vision is Southeast Asian countries prospering, not being poor and dependent on China. So secondly, in China, there's the big debate about China's investments abroad. There are many people in China are saying, why are we loaning such large amounts of money to countries that have questionable repayment? And so I would say this idea of bad loans being made so they can take over the assets is not exactly what most Chinese have in mind. I remember one person, when I brought up the case that's usually mentioned in Sri Lanka of Hambantota port. China had loaned a large amount of money. The Sri Lankans were unable to service the debt, and the Chinese ended up taking over the port, I believe, for 99 years. And so this is often used as an example of debt trap diplomacy. Well, one well-placed person in China said to us, now, why would we do that? You have to ask, why did the Hambantota port not prove economically viable? And the answer is because there was not a lot of traffic, maritime traffic there. It was not economically viable. So explain to me how that's a good investment in China to take over a port that by its definition is economically unviable. Now, some would say, well, the answer is really it provides a base for the PLA Navy, and therefore that's the answer. But the point is, that's a controversial strategy in China, because loaning money to countries that can't repay ultimately forces the Chinese taxpayer, we'll call him the taxpayer, or at least the Chinese people, have to shoulder that burden. And thank you very much. China's getting older. It has more old people. Health costs are going up. It has COVID-19 as a huge problem. Its tourist industry has suffered greatly, or at least the international tourist industry. We have many needs at home. So why are we spending that money? So when the US Secretary of State accuses China of debt trap diplomacy, I think there's a lot of pushback against that idea in China itself.
Okay, thank you. Can I move on to the next question, which is from your observations, what is the role of public perception, either in pushback or in support, in how different countries exercise agency when it deals with Chinese projects?
Cheng-Chwee or Selina, do you want to?
Public perception,
yeah,
or public opinion, or whatever you may wish to address.
I think, Selina, in the implementation thing, you were talking about public opinion is important.
Yeah, so public opinion is also important in the negotiation and bargaining part of the, when China and the host countries are actually negotiating the projects. I mean, public opinion, as I mentioned just now, it acts as a restraint on the public, on the elites of the country, on the government, and when they actually negotiate with China, is a form of pressure, a form of restraint. So it definitely plays a very big part. I mean, you can actually say that, as opposed to, say, liberal democracies, public opinion doesn't play a very big role, right? I mean, that is the conventional wisdom. Like public opinion plays a very big role in liberal democracies, but countries that are developing democracies, or countries that are not full-fledged democracies, public opinion may not play such a big role. And we can actually argue that in our region, public opinion will not be as restraining as it would, say, in a Western liberal democracy. But the fact of the matter is that through the case studies that we've seen in the rivers of Ireland, public opinion actually play a very big role in constraining what leaders can do. So public opinion will circumscribe or limit, the box, it draws the box where leaders can only move in this particular area and not, cannot go over the edge of these boxes. So what I'm trying to say here is that at least in our study of the high-speed railway, public opinion does play a very constraining role. It does not always mean that, public opinion is against this, therefore the project will be cancelled. Not always. But it does, in a way, slow down the project. It does make the government try to explain to the public or try to get a better deal from China in order to win public opinion. I think that's the role of public opinion in our part of the world.
Thank you. Cheng-Chwee?
Yeah, just to add, to echo what Selina mentioned, and I would say that even within one country, you see that public opinion is not static, it's quite dynamic, and it's also not monolithic in the sense that it's like across the board, everything about China is good or bad. You do see that more often than not, public opinion, it's like project by project, and it depends on a number of factors. For example, those that was shadowed by possible debt trap issue, like early on ECRL, was being seen very negatively. But on many other projects that are not involving a loan, but involving investment, involving like a quite equal partnership, involving local and also China, you would see that the public opinion is actually quite positive. For example, the Kuantan Industrial Park, for example, the CRRC project in Batu Gajah, in which China is actually investing to help Malaysia become the center of ASEAN, to cater for ASEAN market for the locomotive manufacturing. So all those public opinion are generally very positive because of it clearly create a lot of economic development benefits. So public opinion matters, but it also change from case to case and also from time to time. ECRL after renegotiation, actually public opinion improved because of after 2019 April, when the renegotiation succeeded in reducing the cost and also improving the terms of local contents, for example, the resources, for example, the labor employment. So public opinion generally improve as the terms of partnership and cooperation improve. Yeah. So it's always dynamic, and it's not like black and white and static in that sense.
Yes. Okay, I think that's something important that we have to bear in mind, that the public opinion can change all the time. The next question, I think will follow on something that you touched upon earlier, but have not had time to elaborate. And it deals with the G7's Build Back Better World. The question is, will smaller states have a bit more space to shop around, or is that an illusion, as small states will always be made to choose one side or the other?
Yeah, I think Kuik, I'm pretty sure Mike and also Selina have their own views, but here my quick response to this question, good question, is that I think from smaller countries' perspective, number one, we do not see this as either or. We do not necessarily have to choose one over the other, because of you have many different types of projects, infrastructure projects. You can always collaborate with Power A on a project X and Power B and C on a project Y. So I do not think that it's a matter of choosing one over the other. That's point number one. Number two, again, I think this is true for smaller countries across the region and also beyond, is that with all those projects and all that, I think we want to see countries to powers to walk the talk. We have been hearing a lot of talks, right? But to what extent we are actually seeing them materialize? Sometimes it will take time, right? So for example, 2018 the Build Act, for example, the EU-Asia connectivity was announced 2018, 3 years ago, right? So we are not really seeing like something concrete after so long. So I think the same can be said with all those newly announced initiatives, either about the Build Back Better World or about the globally connected EU, so on and so forth, right? So we want something more concrete, something similar with vaccine diplomacy. Early on, there was some announcement, but again, now we are seeing it over the last few weeks. I think Southeast Asia, Thailand, and Malaysia, and many other countries, we are seeing the supplies from Japan, from America, and I think all those are good. So I think competition, big power competition on non-military domains, infrastructure development or pandemic diplomacy and all that, clearly fit into the point that we mentioned earlier on. The more, the merrier.
Okay. I would just add on this, and I think all those points are excellent, is that the West, at least most of the Western economies, have a problem that China doesn't. And that basically is that the governments in the democratic Western countries cannot order their corporations to have an interest. They have to see opportunity and stability, and that the investment opportunity in Southeast Asia offers the prospect of return and hopefully a good return. And so the governments in the West, in effect, have to convince one way or another their companies to get interested. Now, some countries in the West have more state enterprises than others, so each is its own case. But the private economy in the West means that the individual investors or participants have a sense, or they have control, and therefore they have to be induced. I think the Western governments, however, are doing several things to make it more attractive for their companies to become involved. They are increasing public investment insurance. We've increased our overseas development assistance, particularly related to infrastructure in Asia. Now, it's still relatively a small amount of money, but it's a lot more than before. And also the Western countries play a big role in the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and so forth. Frankly, even the Asian Development Bank. And we're encouraging, or the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And now the US is encouraging these multilateral, multinational banks and finance agencies to do more. So I would say it's harder for the West to order, so to speak, its companies to be interested, but we are beginning to make it more attractive for private companies to get involved.
Okay, Selina, you want to add something? No. Okay. Then there is another question, which is what should Thailand and ASEAN countries do to benefit from China's policy and investment to become a global technology force, taking into account the context of US-China technological competition? Shall I repeat? Or what should Thailand and ASEAN countries do to benefit from China's policy and investment to become a global technology force, taking into account the context of US-China technological competition?
Well, I'll offer the beginning of a response, but certainly I'm not in a position to offer advice to countries that have their own understanding of their situation. But I would say the first thing, and Thailand, to my knowledge, has done so, is that in negotiating with the Chinese, an important part of the negotiation isn't just the contracts, who supplies the labor, what is the interest rate, and so forth. Those are all important aspects of a negotiation with China. But a very important part of this is technology transfer in the process. In Thailand, you would know more than I, Dr. Anuson, but we were impressed with the degree which the Thai government and Thai negotiators negotiated with China so that Thai workers and engineers particularly Thai workers received training, that also in the end, technology that's transferred to Thailand, that technology and the rights to use it can be transferred to Thailand and so forth. So I would say have negotiations that involve the indigenization, we'll put it that way, of the transferred technology, so that it's a bridge from today to a future in which Thailand or other Southeast Asians have more control over the technology and management. It might be in any given project, at the beginning, the Chinese role of advisors and so on for some countries might be considerable, but there ought to be a process by which gradually the host country, the partner country, gets its people trained, gets the right to use technology, develop it, build its own brand names. That's what China did when it negotiated getting high-speed rail technology from Japan and France. It negotiated a more dependent position initially, but got long-term right to use all of the technology, and now China has its own brand name industry. So I would say the key is in the negotiations. Don't just focus on interest rate and land development rights, as important as those are, but also focus on the long-term technology transfer and training of personnel.
Okay, thank you. Selina?
I think that what Mike is offering is really a positive view of what countries can do to take advantage of that. But in a way, not quite directly answering this question that's been posed to us. But actually, I would actually see the US-China technological competition as having some dangers for us in the region. I was recently looking at all the 5G networks and what countries have signed up to which 5G networks. Which countries have signed up to Huawei, and which countries have signed up to Nokia, Ericsson, or developing their own indigenous 5G capability, like South Korea. You actually see the region. There is this real potential of the region bifurcating into two technological spheres. Now so I'm trying to put here. I'm absolutely agree with Mike that there are all these benefits. But I think that we also must be mindful of this of this challenge that this technological competition between the United States and China is exerting on us. And then we need to mindful that when we choose our providers, according to our own national security interests and also to our own economic needs, right? Our own national interest is involved in this. But we need to be mindful that how these actually play out in the entire region. We might actually end up having a bifurcation of the technology that's in this region.
Thank you, Selina. That is a very important point, and it is something that we here also at the ISC have been working on with our colleagues in the Foreign Ministry and other agencies since last year in trying to see whether that is the trend, and that in the end we in the region would be forced into choosing. I think the point about technological competition, and in the end, whether we are forced to choose which system to use, is something that is very worrying. And maybe this is it's a side issue. Maybe we could arrange some discussions on this some other time to exchange experience and views in the region, because I think it is something that would make a big impact on the ASEAN countries.
Yeah.
Cheng-Chwee, you want to say something?
I think Mike and Selina have already mentioned all the important points. So what is left for me to say is that on this particular issue is that other than Tabana, other than government, I think private sectors actually can also play a role. I'm just thinking about the, I think CP Group, for example, on the EEC project, collaborating with different external actors, like for example, the rail company from China, to take part for the construction of high-speed rail connecting the 3 airports. So that's actually a behavior of not government per se, but from the private sector. So I think in terms of this kind of like technology transfer that Mike alluded to, clearly it's not just about the government action, but I think other outside of the government establishment can play a role as well. And as to the issue of on the digital sector, just to add on to what Selina mentioned, I do think that to a large extent, it will also not up to smaller countries in the region. It will be very much up to what Biden administration will implement the so-called decoupling. At the moment, we are seeing, again, Mike mentioned that very early on, a lot of policy started from Trump is actually being continued. I think decoupling is simply one of that. And we know that decoupling involves a number of sectors. Smaller countries are kind of positive about when some American and Japanese firms are moving out from China and moving to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and some other countries are benefited. But I think the sensitive aspect is really about the digital connectivity. And at the moment, you see that 10 ASEAN countries are making quite different choices. Vietnam, Singapore are very, very cautious. Others are more welcoming to Huawei. But recently, Malaysian government made a choice of actually granting Ericsson, Swedish firm, over Huawei. So we do not know what will happen for the rest of the region. Yeah? And so I think we are seeing more dynamic on these aspects.
Yes, that's why I said it is something that maybe we could have some discussions at some other time, because I think to compare notes on the various ASEAN countries would be of interest. We still have about 5-10 minutes. I'd like to go back to something that we discussed a bit earlier, and maybe we could end with that, because I think it is something very important and connected to the question of Chinese power in Southeast Asia. And that is a rising nationalism in China, and how that comes about. I think we probably understand that already. But I think the question is how much of it is going to go on, and how would that affect our relations with China? Because these days, these nationalism can be spread and also exercised through social media quite easily. So it is something that can be a bit worrying for people who have to make policy decisions. So how do we deal with rising Chinese nationalism? Who would like to start? Professor Lampton?
Well, I'm glad to, but I think my colleagues would have very interesting perspectives, and I want them to have plenty of time. First of all, I agree very much that what we'll call rising nationalism in China is a challenge. All I would point out is the obvious, I believe it's obvious, that rising nationalism is also a global phenomenon, along, I would say, with authoritarian strongman leaders in many countries of the world. So China may be the most important case of rising nationalism. We could argue about that, but certainly the US, America first, is an intrinsically nationalistic idea. So it's not limited to China. That's the first thing I would say. But when we talk about Chinese nationalism, we're talking about a whole narrative in China that every school child from the earliest days is imbued with, as indeed all over the world, young people are imbued with the national story. Well, China's national story is one about bullying containment. That's core elements of this story. And much of the policy, and of course, this produces defensiveness in the West. And then the West reacts and China does. So I see a kind of rising spiral of nationalism, both in China and elsewhere, leading to more difficulties. So I think this whole issue is very important. Now, as it relates to Southeast Asia in particular, I think when you see rising nationalism in China, you see rising concern with security. And when you see rising concern with security in China, you see a rising desire to exert increasing control over its periphery. So if you look at all the friction point, or many of the friction points with China, it's East China Sea, South China Sea, Tibet, Xinjiang, even sometimes Mongolia. When China feels insecure and there's rising nationalism and it sees a security challenge, it tries to exert increasing control over its periphery. So I think this rising nationalism reflects both internal insecurity in China by the elite, but also a kind of understanding of an increasingly hostile periphery which it needs to control. So I think we need to that's one reason that I'm hopeful about interdependence and interconnectivity, because the only way you're going to break down a sort of aggressive nationalism is to create interests among countries that give decision makers an interest in cooperation. So I'm torn between this view of rising nationalism, increasing fragmentation, increasing desire to exert control on the periphery on the one hand, but also believing that we need to foster connectivity and interdependence to give important groups in each society an interest in cooperation. Because if we have rising nationalism and decreasing connectivity or increasing balkanization, that seems to me very bad for everybody's security.
Okay, thank you. Who's next? Cheng-Chwee?
Selina, you want to begin? All right. Just to add on what Mike has already mentioned, and getting back to what earlier on I mentioned about the nationalist legitimation. So that implies that I think it was Chinese ruling elites that make the choice to mobilize. But I completely agree with Mike mentioned that we are seeing also the spiral action reaction. That actually reminds me of what has been happening over the last few weeks. If we follow the news closely, during the G7 summit, for example, you could see that Chinese media basically comparing that with what happened 120 years ago when they got the Ba-Guo-Lian-Jun, right? The alliance of 8 countries 120 years ago to actually invade China and all that. So that is actually there is an action reaction in the sense that whether or not the Chinese elites are mobilizing those sentiments, Chinese people in general do see that on some aspects, at least, certain group of countries are targeting at China, and they do feel that they're being targeted. And there is something that I think Southeast Asian countries actually understand China's sentiment. For example, the Indo-Pacific and also the Quad. You could see that all 10 ASEAN countries have been very, very cautious in keeping distance from Quad, in also Indo-Pacific in large. When we talk about Indo-Pacific, we talk about ASEAN's version of ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. We try to keep distance from the Quad version of Indo-Pacific. Why is that? Because we understand that China perceives Quad particularly as some kind of anti-China or near anti-China kind of containment group. And that would only add to the spiral action reactions that Mike alluded to early on. And I do think that ASEAN countries have to be cautious. We certainly do not want to add momentum along that kind of negative action reaction line.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we've sort of our time is almost up. So I think I will wrap up just a little bit by saying that I hope our audience, having listened to the presentation and discussion today by our 3 authors, would go out and buy and read the book. Because I think the important thing about this book is that in the conclusion that you have made, and also in the concepts that we have discussed today, that I think present an alternative narrative to the idea of Chinese power in Southeast Asia. So I think with that, I like to thank all the 3 authors, Professor Lampton, who joined us from the United States, Selina Ho from Singapore, and Cheng-Chwee in Kuala Lumpur. Thank you very much, and we hope I hope we will be able to collaborate on some other issues in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We look forward to it.
Thank you.